As the prophet of the Lord walked along the path, some small boys came out of the city and harassed him. The DM smiled, thinking of the social encounter he was about to run. But his face fell when the prophet turned to him and said, "I cast conjure animals." Good evening, and welcome to this month's episode of Dungeons and Divinity, where we take a look at God's Word through the lens of the Devil's Game. Now, this month we're covering Elisha, the protege, the erstwhile protege of the prophet Elijah, the pyromancer of Israel. Now, in case you weren't, in case you need a refresher, there's an information card there, talking with a link to the previous video. So we're going to pick up where we left off, where Elisha watches Elijah, activate his divine soul ability and go up into the sky before plane shifting to heaven. And he receives, he catches Elijah's mantle. Now, there are two separate interpretations of this section of the campaign. There's one where the mantle is a magic item that allows Elisha to cast spells that Elijah had cast in life previous, in addition to whatever spells are on his own spell list, as if, with his own saves. Or there's it's just symbolic, basically. It's basically a badge of authority. And I'm going to stick with my rules for staying away from things like homebrew as much as I can. So while it's very valid that the mantle is a homebrewed magic artifact, like, for instance, the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail. Well, actually, no, the Holy Grail is just a phylactery, but we'll get to that in a later video. I'm going to be going through this as if all of these spells that Elisha cast are actually from his own class list. So we're going to start, and I'll mention ones that may or may not have been cast through the mantle. But we are going to say that when Elisha receives this prophetic mantle, he basically hits level 20. This is very much a max level campaign because he throws some high level spells out of the gate, and if we're not going with the magic item interpretation, that means that he has to have the capability to do so. And so with that, let's get started, shall we? So Elisha comes down from the mountain and casts the first of his miracles, the first of his listed spells, casting control water on the Jordan to part it so he can walk across. This is one of the spells that could arguably have been stored in the mantle. Then he makes his way to feed the he makes his way to a city that is under famine because because the water or under a drought because the water has gone bitter, and he casts Purify Food and Drink. Once again, this could very well have easily been a mantle spell, and I'm keeping the class list a bit under wraps for now, and because due to the next feat, some people have him pegged under a certain class, and I'm about to tell you why you're wrong. But, so anyways, he makes his way to Bethel, and this is where people would say, oh, Elisha's a druid, because druids and rangers, and he's obviously not a ranger because he's way too castery, because druids can conjure animals, and he obviously conjures 2 brown bears, which both, and conjure animals does let you conjure either 1 CR2 or, 1 animal that's challenge rating 2, 2 animals that are challenge rating 1, 4 animals that are challenge rating 1/2, or 8 animals that are challenge rating 1/8, unless you pump the spell. Now, bears are challenge rating 1, and he conjures 2 of them. So, it's very obvious that he's, casting conjure animals, which is listed only as a druid or a ranger spell. However, Elisha can't be a druid because there's never any mention of him going into wild shape. And seeing as how wild shape is what druids do, he can't be a druid. So, here's the question. How do you get, without the use of a homebrewed magic item, how do you get a spell on your spell list that's outside of your usual class list? And here's the answer. Or a high-level spell that's outside of your usual class list, because as, mentioned with Elijah, there are feats that you can take that let you take first-level spells and cantrips from outside of your usual spell list. The Magic Initiated and the Rituals feat. Well, so how do you get high-level spells from outside of your spell list? You play a bard. Yes, Elisha is a College of Lore bard, mostly because College of Lore get their additional magical secrets at 6th level. So, bards get magical secrets, which means for the regular bard, at 10th, 14th, and 18th level, they can pick 2 spells from any spell list and add it to their own. College of Lore bards get additional magical secrets at 6th level, which means they can get up to a total of 8 additional spells, as opposed to the 6 for other bards. Now, aside from the expanded spell list, Elisha doesn't really do that many bard things. However, he does cast a couple of spells that appear on the bard list that aren't on the druid or cleric list, which, even if we were going to do the mantle, the mantle is a magic item that gives him cleric spells thing, he'd still need access to, later spells, which appear on the bard list, so he's a bard. Get used to it. So, after he conjures the bears, and the bears absolutely slaughter the boys for the horrible crime of mocking him, he goes to a widow, and she she's like, I'm gonna have to sell my son, I'm gonna have to sell my kids into slavery because I need to clear my debt. So he casts, I'm gonna say he casts create food and water, which to make vegetable oil. I'm gonna say that falls under the purview of the spell. As a DM ruling, it's stretching the rules a bit, but seems like Yahweh plays pretty fast and loose in this, in his campaign. So I say it's well within the purview of create food and water to make vegetable oil and sell, make enough to sell it. Unfortunately, for the people who bought that vegetable oil, it only lasts for 24 hours before going bad. So, Elisha helps a widow scam some people to get money to pay the widow's debt. And a few years, a few later, he in a story that's very reminiscent of Elijah, he helps a woman conceive, and then that kid dies, and then he casts Revivify on the kid. Now, and once again, this is very much one that could very well have been cast from the mantle, and I've counted out the list. There are 8 spells that don't fall under the bard spell list that he is shown as casting. So, and College of Lore Bards get 8. So on we go. So he, and then and then there's an instance where he, the sons of the prophets accidentally make some food with poison gourds, and he casts Purify Food and Drink on it to unpoison the poison. And then he casts Goodberry to feed prophets again. And it's very much specifically mentions that the miracle is letting them be sustained on the little amount of food that they get. So it is very much Goodberry as opposed to create food and drink. And now we get to Naaman. Naaman being a leper. And so he says to Naaman, okay, you go and submerge yourself into the Jordan 7 times, and if you do so, you will be clean. Now, how does one make a spell that goes off at a certain trigger? Now, of course, the spell that will be triggered is Removing Curse, which is a cleric spell, so it could very well fall under the mantle thing, and once again is a magical secret for the purposes of this discussion. Now, what he did was he put a Glyph of Warding. Now, Glyph of Wardings are fun. See, you can either make them explode when certain conditions are met, or you can store a spell of equal or lesser level to what you cast. So, Glyph of Warding is a 3rd level spell, but you can pump it higher, and if you pump it higher, you can store higher level spells in the glyph. Remove Curse is also a 3rd level spell. So, he casts Glyph of Warding at 3rd level and, puts Remove Curse into it, and tells, and puts the condition for the removal of the cursed leprosy as, after he has been submerged for 7 times in the Jordan. So he's like, okay, you go to the Jordan and you submerge yourself 7 times. Then you will be clean. Now, Naaman almost doesn't do it. He goes but his servant girl's like, hey, if he told you to do some grand thing, you would have done it, right? What's the harm of taking a bath? So he goes, he submerges himself, and then on the 7th time, the glyph of warding triggers, and the curse is removed. Now, Naaman goes back to thank Elisha, and Elisha does not take payment. And, Naaman goes off and leaves. But Elisha's servant, who I'm gonna say, since he's a named character, he is probably a player character. Gehazi, decides, and he's not really shown as casting any spells. This is one of the few stories where he's actually named. He's just kind of running errands for Elisha. I'm going to say he's a rogue, because he does a sneaky roguey thing. He goes to Naaman, and he's like, well, see, Elisha changed his mind because he's burning through a lot of valuable spell components, and we'll take that silver. So he receives the payment from Naaman, goes back, and Elisha finds out and gets pissed, and he's like, okay, I removed Naaman's curse. I'm just gonna bestow it on you, and cast bestow curse on his servant and banishes him because, he's a leper, and an unclean person can't be seen hanging around with the prophet of God, can he? And so after this debacle, he goes on, encounters an army, and instead of doing doing what his former mentor would have done and just fireballing it, he gets a bit devious with this army of enemy soldiers, because he's playing very nice with the kings of Israel and Judah, but these aren't Israeli or Judean soldiers. But he casts hypnotic pattern, which makes a brilliant pattern in the sky that charms people who see it and fail wisdom save. The army fails its wisdom save, and then he casts mass suggestion, and probably the DM likely gives the soldiers disadvantage on their wisdom save against the suggestion, and they fail, and they follow him into the city where they're slaughtered by Israelite soldiers, because of course, what's a Bible story without mass genocide? Anyways, and we move on. There's another instance where a prophet loses his axe in a river, and Elisha casts levitate on the axe to float it up above the water. It's described as floating in the water, but anyways, levitate allows you to lift an object or person of 500 pounds or less and move it up and down 20 feet in as an action. You can move it horizontally, but you can't do it mentally. You have to do it by pulling, or if you're levitating yourself, essentially walking yourself along, like say a wall or something. So, and so he leads a fairly eventful life, prophesying for the kings of Israel, and basically being basically getting people to murder hobo those who he deems that Yahweh has told him to destroy, because he's very much less directly violent than his predecessor, but he does get Jehu to just completely red wedding the house of Ahab, and so he's more about passing the murder hobory down the line instead of just fireballing everything, which I honestly is kind of a bit of a refresher. But he almost does twice as many miracles as Elijah, but then he becomes sick, and he's nearly getting, and he's reaching his death, So he goes to his tomb, and he does one last casting of Glyph of Warding, and he loads it with Revivify, and he states the condition for the first body that touches my bones will be brought, will have Revivify cast on it. So he dies, he gets put in the tomb, a year passes, his flesh rots away, leaving his bones, and Glyph of Warding only lasts until it's triggered. So, about a year later, some murderers just toss a body into his tomb, and the body, gets up because it had Revivify cast on it, and I bet that, that made the poor victim's day. It's like, oh, I'm alive again. Goody. So, anyways, that's a brief overview of the twice as many miracles of the prophet Elisha, and why bards are crazily versatile. But anyways, be sure to click like, share, subscribe, do all the YouTube things, and keep an eye out for my 100 subscriber stream on this Sunday. There should be a few interesting announcements coming then. I will have a Twitter stream linked in the description below if you want to submit questions or suggestions of quotes from apologists that I will read in my golden voices, precious, or some other, what's the word? Impressions that you've heard me do, like. If you'll ask Atheist Pastor, he thinks I do a pretty good Kent Hovind. I do a fairly good Trump if I say so myself. But yeah, sure, like, share, subscribe, do all the YouTube things. And remember, indoctrination is a hell of a drug. Look for the bare necessities, the simple bare necessities. Forget about your worries and your strife. I mean the bare necessities. That's why a bear can rest at ease when he's just mauling a bunch of kids, just over and over again. Just the screams and blood spatters and growling, and you're gonna need a mop after that. Seriously.